I watched the reports arrive while my superiors waited for the enemy to slow. The numbers did not agree with the orders, and the system had no place for that. I filed what I could prove and left the rest unsaid. When the columns kept moving, the weight of it stayed on my desk. In the late summer of 1944, the European war had entered a new operational phase. Allied forces had landed in Normandy in June, broken out of the beachhead in July, and were advancing rapidly across northern France. German formations were retreating eastward under constant pressure, their movements constrained by air attack, disrupted communications, and severe shortages of fuel. By August, the German High Command was no longer focused on stopping the invasion outright, but on stabilizing a front line somewhere west of the German border. At this time, the headquarters of Oberkommando des Heeres maintained a logistics assessment section attached to Fremde Heere West, the intelligence branch responsible for evaluating Allied capabilities. Its task was routine but essential: to assess enemy supply capacity, estimate consumption rates, and forecast how long Allied momentum could be sustained. One of the officers assigned to this work was Oberstleutnant Karl-Heinz Mattens, a career staff officer in his early 40s. Mattens had joined the Army before the war and had spent most of his service in planning and analysis rather than field command. His experience was considered solid but unremarkable. He had worked on transport planning during the early campaigns and later on fuel allocation studies for armored formations. By 1944, his work consisted largely of reviewing reports, maps, and intercepted material to produce estimates for senior planners. Mattens's daily routine was structured and repetitive. Each morning began with the review of overnight situation reports, rail movements detected by aerial reconnaissance, estimates of truck traffic on key roads, and summaries of Allied airfield activity. These reports were compiled from a mixture of sources: air photographs, intercepted radio traffic, and field observations from retreating units. His responsibility was to consolidate this information into a coherent assessment of Allied logistical capacity. Fuel was central to his work. German operations had become increasingly constrained by shortages of gasoline and diesel. Armored units often reported being immobilized not by enemy action but by empty tanks. Staff discussions repeatedly returned to the same assumption: Allied advances would eventually slow for the same reason. The prevailing view within German planning circles held that the enemy's supply lines, stretched across the Channel and across devastated French infrastructure, would impose natural limits. At August, Mattens noticed that incoming data did not align neatly with this assumption. Reports from Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights, though fewer in number due to Allied air superiority, contained recurring references to large storage areas near ports and temporary depots far inland. Photographs showed extensive vehicle parks operating without apparent fuel rationing. Initially, these observations were treated as temporary anomalies. Allied forces were expected to draw down their reserves quickly during periods of rapid movement. The destruction of bridges, rail yards, and refineries in France was believed to impose severe constraints. In internal memoranda, Mattens and his colleagues noted these factors while emphasizing that consumption rates would soon exceed delivery capacity. Yet the reports continued. Signals intelligence indicated steady fuel distribution to frontline units, even during extended operations. Prisoner interrogations, summarized and circulated at headquarters, included casual remarks about fuel availability that stood in contrast to German experience. Allied soldiers spoke of frequent refueling points and standardized supply procedures that required little improvisation. Mattens's role was not to question doctrine, but to quantify observed realities. He began compiling a separate file, distinct from the main daily summary, focusing solely on fuel-related indicators. This file included aerial photographs annotated with estimated tank volumes, intercepted references to pipeline construction, and comparative tables of Allied and German fuel consumption. One set of photographs, taken over northern France near Cherbourg, drew his attention. The images showed extensive storage installations that had been constructed or expanded shortly after the port's capture. The scale was larger than expected for a facility still under development. Similar images appeared from areas around the Seine and later near the Belgian border. The operational problem was not immediately framed as a crisis. Instead, it emerged gradually as an inconsistency. German planning models assumed that port capacity and overland transport would limit fuel throughput. These models had been used to predict pauses in Allied offensives. However, the predicted pauses did not occur. Allied formations continued to advance, sometimes halting briefly for regrouping, but not for lack of fuel. Within staff discussions, the explanation often defaulted to exceptional circumstances or short-term stockpiling. Mattens noted these interpretations in the margins of his reports. He also noted separately that the scale and geographic spread of storage sites suggested something more systematic. By early September, the Allies had reached the borders of Germany and the Netherlands. Antwerp's port facilities were under Allied control, though not yet fully operational. Even before Antwerp was supplying the front, Allied units maintained operational tempo. Mattens reviewed transport estimates showing sustained truck traffic over long distances. German rail interception efforts had failed to disrupt these flows decisively. During this period, Mattens attended a routine briefing at which fuel estimates were presented to senior officers. The briefing followed established patterns, projected shortages, expected slowing of enemy movement, and the assumption that German defensive positions could be consolidated during this window. The data supporting these projections was selective, emphasizing infrastructure damage and theoretical transport limits. Mattens did not openly challenge these conclusions. His position did not afford him that latitude. However, in his personal notes, he recorded discrepancies between Allied fuel availability and observed operational behavior. He also began comparing Allied distribution methods with German practices, noting differences in standardization and redundancy. The limitations of German doctrine became apparent through absence rather than failure. There was no single report indicating a dramatic Allied fuel breakthrough. Instead, there was a steady accumulation of evidence that fuel constraints were not shaping Allied decisions in the way German planners expected. This absence of constraint was itself a significant data point. By mid-September, Mattens's private file on Allied fuel capacity had grown substantial. It remained unofficial and was not circulated beyond his immediate colleagues. The atmosphere within headquarters discouraged deviation from accepted interpretations. Resources were strained, and attention was focused on immediate defensive concerns. Nevertheless, the operational implications were clear to those examining the data closely. If Allied fuel reserves were as extensive as the evidence suggested, then the assumption of an inevitable slowdown was flawed. Defensive planning based on that assumption risked misallocation of scarce resources. Mattens continued his work, aware that his observations ran counter to prevailing expectations, but uncertain how they would be received if presented formally. The routine of daily reporting persisted, even as the underlying problem became harder to ignore. At the end of September, as autumn weather began to affect operations, Mattens prepared another summary of fuel-related indicators. He placed it in his personal file, marked for future reference. The data did not yet compel an immediate revision of doctrine, but it no longer supported the old one with confidence. The situation remained unresolved, suspended between established belief and accumulating evidence, as German forces prepared for the next phase of the campaign. By October 1944, the operational situation on the Western Front had stabilized only superficially. The Allied advance had slowed in places, but not in the manner German planners had predicted. The pause was uneven, driven by terrain, weather, and tactical resistance rather than by systemic shortages. German intelligence assessments continued to emphasize logistical limits, yet the pattern of Allied activity did not conform to those expectations. Within the logistics assessment section, Oberstleutnant Karl-Heinz Mertens found his workload increasing rather than diminishing. The volume of incoming material grew as German units fell back and intelligence collection shifted eastward. Reports now included observations from the Low Countries, where Allied forces were concentrating large formations for operations along the Rhine. Fuel indicators remained central. Luftwaffe reconnaissance, though increasingly sporadic, still captured evidence of extensive storage areas. In Belgium and southern Netherlands, photographs revealed depots positioned well beyond immediate port facilities. Some were concealed in wooded areas, others dispersed across former industrial sites. Their locations suggested deliberate planning to reduce vulnerability rather than improvised stockpiling. Mertens began to compare monthly estimates rather than daily figures. When aggregated, the data suggested continuity rather than depletion. Allied units that had been active in August and September showed no corresponding decline in operational readiness by October. Armored formations rotated, refueled, and returned to the line with minimal delay. At the same time, German losses related to fuel scarcity increased. Reports from panzer divisions described vehicles abandoned during withdrawals due to lack of fuel. Training units reported reductions in exercise schedules. Rail transport, constrained by bombing and material shortages, could not compensate. These German reports crossed Mertens' desk daily, creating an unavoidable contrast. Official doctrine still held that Allied logistics were vulnerable. Briefings cited long supply lines, dependence on a limited number of ports, and the expectation that winter conditions would compound these difficulties. These assessments were not fabricated, they were based on established principles of military logistics. What troubled Mertens was that the empirical evidence increasingly failed to validate them. Repeated failures to observe the expected Allied slowdown accumulated quietly. Operations such as Martin Garden, though costly and ultimately limited in outcome, demonstrated a willingness to commit fuel-intensive airborne and armored assets simultaneously. Even after that operation stalled, Allied forces did not exhibit the kind of systemic exhaustion German planners anticipated. Mertens' internal file expanded further. He added comparative charts estimating fuel throughput based on observed vehicle density and movement patterns. He included intercepted communications referencing standardized refueling procedures and pipeline extensions. One intercepted report mentioned a pipeline network extending from the Channel coast toward forward depots, reducing reliance on vulnerable road transport. Within staff meetings, these details were rarely discussed. Time constraints and hierarchical norms limited debate. Intelligence summaries were expected to support operational planning, not complicate it. When discrepancies arose, they were often attributed to temporary surges or localized conditions. The tension between observed reality and official interpretation became more pronounced as autumn progressed. German defensive plans continued to rely on the assumption that Allied mobility would diminish. Counteroffensive concepts, including limited armored thrusts, were justified on the belief that enemy fuel shortages would restrict their ability to respond rapidly. Mertens noted the risks inherent in this logic. His own experience in fuel planning made him cautious about assuming constraints without clear evidence. Yet his role remained analytical, not directive. He continued to document rather than advocate. By November, Allied forces were conducting sustained operations along a broad front, including heavy fighting in the Hürtgen forest and preparations for further advances. Fuel consumption was high, yet there was no corresponding intelligence indicating critical shortages. Instead, new storage sites appeared farther east. German headquarters, under pressure from multiple fronts, had little appetite for reassessing foundational assumptions. The intelligence apparatus functioned, but within narrowing parameters. Mertens' observations circulated informally among a small group of colleagues, some of whom shared his concerns but lacked influence. The gap between doctrine and evidence widened incrementally. It did not provoke a sudden confrontation, but it altered the internal calculus of those who examined the data closely. For Mertens, the question was no longer whether Allied fuel reserves were substantial, but whether German planning could afford to ignore that fact. As winter approached, the accumulated indicators pointed toward a structural advantage rather than a temporary condition.
The operational implications remained unresolved within the formal system, even as their consequences became increasingly apparent on the ground.
By late November 1944, the Western Front had entered a period of sustained attrition. Weather conditions worsened, limiting air operations on some days, but Allied ground activity remained consistent. German planners interpreted the reduced tempo as confirmation of earlier expectations. Mertens, however, observed that the pattern still did not reflect fuel exhaustion. Instead, it reflected deliberate operational pacing. The Logistics Assessment section received updated material from multiple sources. Aerial reconnaissance, though intermittent, continued to identify fuel-related infrastructure extending eastward. Intercepts referenced pipeline maintenance schedules rather than emergency measures. These details suggested continuity and planning depth rather than improvisation. Mertens' analysis shifted in emphasis. He began focusing less on absolute quantities and more on system resilience. Allied fuel supply appeared to be structured to absorb disruption. Storage was dispersed, transport routes were redundant, and standardized procedures reduced dependency on individual nodes. German doctrine, by contrast, assumed vulnerability at key points. The turning point for Mertens' assessment came through a routine comparison exercise. He was tasked with reviewing projected Allied fuel availability for December against planned German defensive operations. The projections, based on existing models, predicted significant Allied constraints. Yet when he overlaid observed indicators, vehicle movements, depot expansion, and pipeline reach, the projections no longer aligned. Rather than revising the entire model, which was beyond his authority, Mertens made a limited adjustment. He recalculated fuel availability using conservative estimates drawn solely from confirmed observations. Even under these restrained assumptions, the results exceeded official projections by a substantial margin. This discrepancy posed a professional dilemma. Submitting revised figures would challenge established assessments and potentially disrupt operational planning. Not submitting them would perpetuate assumptions that no longer matched reality. Mertens chose an intermediate course. He prepared a supplemental memorandum framed as a technical clarification rather than a doctrinal challenge. The document focused narrowly on fuel distribution efficiency, avoiding broader strategic implications. It cited specific observations, pipeline extensions, depot dispersion, and standardized refueling intervals without drawing explicit conclusions about Allied endurance. The memorandum was circulated to a small number of senior staff officers responsible for logistics coordination. It did not question existing plans directly. Instead, it recommended caution in assuming fuel-related limitations when evaluating Allied response capacity. The reaction was muted. Some recipients acknowledged the data but emphasized that broader constraints would still apply. Others deferred consideration, citing more immediate concerns. The memorandum did not prompt an immediate change in planning. Nevertheless, the act of formalizing his observations altered Mertens' position. His analysis was now on record. Future assessments could be compared against it. This introduced a degree of personal risk, not in terms of disciplinary action, but professional credibility. If his assessment proved incorrect, it would reflect poorly on his judgment. As December approached, German forces prepared for a major counteroffensive in the Ardennes. Planning assumptions emphasized surprise, weather-induced Allied air limitations, and the expectation that enemy fuel shortages would delay response. Mertens was not involved in operational planning, but he reviewed logistical estimates supporting these assumptions. The estimates continued to rely on the premise that Allied fuel reserves near the front were limited. Mertens' earlier memorandum was not referenced. He noted this omission but did not attempt to intervene further. His role remained advisory, and the operational momentum had already developed. During the initial days of the Ardennes offensive, Mertens monitored reports closely. Allied movements were disrupted by weather and surprise, but fuel-related indicators did not suggest systemic paralysis. As the operation progressed, Allied counter-movements increased in scale and coordination. Mertens updated his internal file with new observations. Fuel depots in Belgium and northern France remained active. Pipeline operations resumed rapidly after temporary disruptions. Truck traffic intensified rather than diminished. These developments reinforced his earlier assessment. The personal dimension of risk became clearer. Mertens' professional standing depended on the accuracy of his analyses. While he had avoided direct confrontation, his supplemental memorandum implicitly challenged assumptions underlying a major operation. The outcome of that operation would influence how his work was perceived. By the end of December, as the Ardennes offensive stalled, the disparity between expectation and outcome became evident. Allied forces mobilized reserves and sustained operations despite the conditions German planners had believed would constrain them. Fuel availability was not the limiting factor German doctrine had anticipated. Within the logistics assessment section, discussions became more candid. Some officers revisited earlier assumptions, acknowledging that Allied supply systems were more robust than previously believed. Mertens' memorandum was referenced informally, its data now more difficult to dismiss. The turning point was not a single event, but an accumulation of outcomes that validated earlier observations. Mertens' unofficial adjustment, documenting what he saw rather than what doctrine predicted, had proven aligned with operational reality. As the new year approached, the question was no longer whether Allied fuel reserves were extensive, but how German planning structures would respond to that recognition. For Mertens, the professional risk he had taken was partially mitigated by events, but its broader implications remained uncertain.
In January 1945, the aftermath of the Ardennes offensive forced a reassessment across multiple levels of the German command structure. The failure of the operation was attributed publicly to weather, air power, and material inferiority. Privately, staff sections began examining the assumptions that had shaped planning. Logistics, long treated as a limiting factor for the enemy, became a subject of renewed scrutiny. Within the logistics assessment section, Oberstleutnant Karl-Heinz Mertens was directed to consolidate fuel-related observations from the previous 6 months into a retrospective report. The task was administrative in nature, intended to support post-operation evaluation rather than immediate decision-making. Nevertheless, it provided an opportunity to formalize what had previously existed only in fragments and informal notes. Mertens approached the assignment cautiously. He did not frame the report as a critique of doctrine. Instead, he structured it as a chronological review of observed Allied fuel indicators, accompanied by references to operational outcomes. The tone was restrained and factual. Where projections had failed to align with events, he noted the discrepancy without assigning blame. The report documented repeated instances in which Allied operations continued at scale despite conditions that German models had identified as fuel-limiting. It included aerial reconnaissance summaries, intercepted communications, and movement estimates. Particular attention was given to the geographic dispersion of storage sites and the rapid restoration of disrupted supply routes. When circulated among senior staff officers, the report elicited mixed responses. Some acknowledged its accuracy, but argued that it reflected exceptional Allied industrial capacity rather than a flaw in German planning principles. Others viewed it as an implicit challenge to long-held assumptions about logistical vulnerability. Institutional pushback was subtle but present. In subsequent briefings, references to Allied fuel abundance were often contextualized as temporary advantages. The emphasis remained on German constraints rather than enemy resilience. Mertens' report was filed, cited, but not used as a basis for immediate doctrinal revision. At the same time, operational realities continued to reinforce its conclusions. Allied forces crossed the Rhine with extensive logistical preparation. Fuel supply supported large-scale river crossings, sustained armored exploitation, and continuous air-ground coordination. German intelligence reports now described Allied supply systems as elastic and redundant, terms that had previously been avoided. Mertens' professional standing shifted incrementally.
He was not promoted, nor was he marginalized. His analyses were increasingly consulted on technical matters, particularly those involving transport capacity and fuel distribution. However, broader strategic discussions remained insulated from fundamental reassessment. The system absorbed his findings without fully integrating their implications. The stakes of his earlier actions became clearer in hindsight. By documenting discrepancies rather than challenging authority directly, Mertens had preserved his position while contributing to an emerging understanding of Allied logistical strength. Yet the institutional response demonstrated the limits of adaptation under sustained pressure. As German forces retreated further into their own territory, fuel shortages became absolute. The contrast between German scarcity and Allied abundance was no longer abstract. It manifested in abandoned vehicles, curtailed training, and immobilized formations. The reports Mertens reviewed daily now reflected conditions he had anticipated months earlier, but on the German side. Within headquarters, discussions grew pragmatic. The notion that Allied operations would collapse under logistical strain was quietly abandoned. Planning shifted towards delaying actions and local defense rather than counteroffensive maneuver. Fuel considerations focused on conservation rather than exploitation. Mertens continued his work through February, aware that the war's outcome was no longer in question. His role had narrowed to documentation and assessment, tasks that would shape the historical record more than immediate decisions. The pushback he encountered was no longer overt, it had been rendered irrelevant by events. As Allied forces advanced and German command structures fragmented, the opportunity for institutional reform disappeared. The recognition of Allied fuel capacity came too late to influence strategy meaningfully. It remained, instead, an analytical conclusion recorded in files and reports. For Mertens, the experience underscored the tension between doctrine and observation. His careful documentation had survived internal resistance, but it had not altered the trajectory of events. The consequences of earlier assumptions had already been realized on the battlefield. By the early spring of 1945, as Allied forces prepared for final operations into central Germany, the logistical disparity was evident to all who examined the data. What had once been an internal inconsistency had become an established fact, acknowledged but no longer actionable.
By March 1945, the structure of German military intelligence and logistics planning was disintegrating under the weight of events. Headquarters locations shifted frequently as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and advanced deep into western Germany. Communication lines were unreliable, staff sections were fragmented, and long-term analytical work gave way to immediate reporting and record preservation. Oberstleutnant Karl-Heinz Mertens remained at his post as long as the administrative framework existed. His final months were spent compiling archives rather than producing forward-looking assessments. Fuel reports, transport estimates, and reconnaissance summaries were organized for reference, not for planning. The purpose was no longer to influence operations, but to leave a coherent record. During this period, Allied fuel capacity was no longer debated within German circles, it was directly observable. Large armored formations advanced without interruption. Air operations resumed at full scale whenever weather permitted. Temporary fuel depots appeared rapidly behind advancing fronts, supplied by a combination of pipelines, railheads, and truck columns operating with coordination that German planners had once considered unattainable under combat conditions. German officers encountering Allied forces during retreats or surrender reported consistent impressions. Fuel trucks were numerous and standardized. Refueling points were clearly marked and regularly spaced. There was little evidence of rationing at the tactical level. These observations were recorded without commentary, as explanation was no longer required. Mertens' earlier analyses were occasionally referenced in these final reports, not as warnings but as confirmations. The question of whether Allied fuel reserves were sufficient had been settled by experience. The remaining question concerned how German doctrine had failed to account for such capacity.
In April 1945, as Allied forces encircled remaining German units and command authority collapsed, Merton's section received orders to prepare documents for transfer or destruction. Sensitive material was to be secured, but analytical reports were to be preserved where possible. Merton supervised the consolidation of his fuel assessments into a single dossier, stripped of commentary and framed as observational record. The dossier contained no dramatic conclusions. It documented storage capacity, distribution methods, redundancy, and continuity over time. It avoided attributing causation or responsibility. In tone and structure, it reflected Merton's approach throughout the war, restrained, factual, and limited to what could be supported by evidence. Following Germany's surrender in May 1945, Allied intelligence teams collected surviving documents from German headquarters. Among the materials recovered were logistics assessments and retrospective reports. Merton's dossier was included, catalogued alongside other technical evaluations. There is no record of his personal interrogation focusing specifically on this work, suggesting it was viewed as confirmatory rather than revelatory. In post-war analyses conducted by Allied historians and military planners, German intelligence failures were often characterized as ideological or organizational. Less attention was paid to cases where accurate observation existed but was constrained by institutional inertia. Merton's work fell into this category. It neither altered operations nor challenged authority overtly, yet it accurately described a critical imbalance. The quiet legacy of this work lies in its demonstration of how large systems absorb inconvenient information. German planners did not lack data. They lacked the flexibility to revise assumptions under pressure. The scale of Allied oil reserves and distribution capacity was visible months before it was fully acknowledged. By the time it was accepted, it no longer mattered. Mertens himself did not publish memoirs or theoretical reflections. After the war, he lived outside public attention. His contribution remained embedded in documents rather than narratives. It represents a form of unsung analysis, work that was correct, restrained, and ultimately overshadowed by events. From a historical perspective, the episode illustrates the limits of doctrine when confronted with industrial-scale logistics. Allied success in sustaining operations was not the result of improvisation alone, but of deliberate planning, redundancy, and an understanding that fuel was not merely a resource, but an operational enabler. German intelligence recognized this gradually, but recognition did not translate to adaptation. The story of Allied oil reserves, as seen through German eyes, is therefore not of one of sudden shock, but of slow realization. It unfolded through routine reports, annotated photographs, and quiet memoranda. Its significance lies not in a single decision or individual, but in the gap between what was observed and what could be acted upon. Today, these records offer insight into how wars are shaped as much by logistics as by combat, and how unsung individuals within vast systems can perceive realities that institutions struggle to accept. If you value historically grounded stories that focus on overlooked details and individuals whose work remained largely unseen, consider supporting the continuation of this series.